The chandeliers glittered like frozen stars above the grand hall of the Washington Grand Hotel, each crystal droplet catching the light and scattering it across the marble floor like tiny shards of moonlight. The room was a theater of power. Senators in tailored suits huddled in corners, whispering about votes and lobbyists. Billionaires compared portfolios with the ease of men who had never known hunger. Ambassadors raised glasses of wine, their smiles practiced and rehearsed like speeches written in advance. Everywhere, laughter echoed, hollow, deliberate, the kind of laughter people used when they wanted to be overheard. The banquet wasn't just dinner. It was performance. Every toast, every handshake, every word carried weight, designed to impress or intimidate. In a place like this, the menu wasn't the main course, reputation was. And then the room shifted. Into the hall walked Naomi Campbell Rivers, a name whispered in boardrooms across continents. She moved without a single word, yet her silence carried further than any speech. Draped in a midnight blue silk gown that shimmered under the chandeliers, she looked like she had been carved out of elegance itself. Her gown caught the light in waves, reminding the crowd of deep oceans where secrets are kept. Her posture was a lesson in restraint, head lifted, steps unhurried, shoulders drawn back not in arrogance but in certainty. People turned to look, some pretending not to, others failing to hide their curiosity. The whispers began almost instantly. "That's Naomi Rivers, the one who built Horizon International. She's worth more than half this room combined. I heard she negotiates billion-dollar contracts without raising her voice once." To many, she was a legend, a self-made CEO who had transformed a modest logistics firm into a global empire spanning energy, trade, and technology. She was proof that brilliance could not be contained by prejudice, and that silence could be sharper than noise. But to others, to men like Alexander Whitmore, she was a threat. Not everyone respected her. At the head table sat Alexander Whitmore, his figure slouched in calculated ease. His white tuxedo gleamed under the chandelier, his cufflinks flashing each time he raised his glass. He had the air of a man convinced the world was his to own, because in many ways it was. A notorious Wall Street power broker, Whitmore had broken companies with a single phone call, turned allies into beggars overnight, and mocked rivals so thoroughly that they never recovered their dignity. He thrived on cruelty, and tonight he was hungry. Whitmore's eyes tracked Naomi the moment she entered, his smirk spreading slow and deliberate. To him, she was a puzzle that didn't belong in the picture, a black woman who had climbed too high, too fast, who didn't play by the old rules of submission and silence. He couldn't stand that she carried herself like she belonged more than anyone else in the room. And so, as he sipped his wine, he decided he would remind her of her place tonight. The orchestra struck a chord, a bright flourish that drew scattered applause. Waiters moved gracefully between tables, silver trays balancing glasses of vintage champagne and dishes plated like works of art. The air carried the faint scent of roasted truffle, aged wine, and expensive perfume. But beneath the music, beneath the laughter, beneath the polished performance of diplomacy and wealth, there was an undercurrent, a tension that only a few could sense. It hummed faintly, like the vibration of a string drawn too tight, waiting for one careless touch to snap. Naomi felt it. She had walked into enough rooms like this to recognize hostility hidden behind polite smiles. Her gaze drifted across the tables, taking in every detail. The way a senator avoided her eyes, the way a billionaire's wife whispered and glanced in her direction, the way Whitmore leaned back, studying her like a predator about to strike. Still, Naomi gave nothing away. Her expression remained steady, her lips curved in the faintest suggestion of a smile. She moved to her seat with unhurried grace, pulling out her chair as though she had all the time in the world. Her gown whispered against the marble as she sat, every motion deliberate, every gesture controlled. Around her, conversation resumed, but it was thinner now, stretched across the room like glass about to shatter. Guests glanced back and forth between her and Whitmore, as though already sensing the storm that was about to rise between them. Whitmore raised his glass, his smirk widening as if he already knew the script. He thought he had the power, thought he had the room in his pocket. Naomi folded her hands in her lap and sat perfectly still. She didn't need to know the script. She had already written the ending. The orchestra swelled once more. Glasses clinked in ritual toasts. And with every passing second, the banquet stopped being a celebration and became something else entirely. A stage where power would be tested, where arrogance would clash with restraint, and where silence might prove louder than the cruelest insult. The stage was set. As Naomi took her seat, the atmosphere in the grand hall shifted ever so slightly. The scrape of her chair against marble sounded louder than it should have, echoing in a room filled with hollow chatter. People pretended not to stare, but their eyes followed her every move. She sat with composure, arranging her napkin with the precision of someone who knew her presence unsettled people. Then came the sharp click of heels. A hostess in a bright red dress emerged from the shadows of the room, her presence as deliberate as the color she wore. The red was striking, but not in a way that celebrated elegance. It screamed for attention, for drama. Each step of her stiletto heels struck the marble floor like the tapping of daggers, slicing into the stillness of the moment. She approached Naomi's chair with a carefully rehearsed smile, the kind that had venom behind courtesy. Leaning down, she tilted her head as if to whisper something discreet, but her voice carried, loud enough for half the table to hear, sharp enough to wound. "Miss Rivers," she said, her tone dripping with feigned innocence, "are you sure you're at the right event? This isn't a charity banquet." For half a second, the room froze, and then laughter rippled through the air like a cruel draft sneaking under a door. It wasn't joyous laughter. It was sharp, awkward, and mean-spirited. Some guests chuckled nervously. Others forced smiles as if afraid to oppose the moment. A few turned away, embarrassed by the cruelty, but unwilling to risk their own place at the table by speaking out. Naomi did not flinch. She did not reach for a comeback. Instead, she let the insult pass through her like smoke. Slowly, with elegance untarnished, she reached for her glass of water, lifted it to her lips, and took a sip. The crystal glass trembled faintly in her hand, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of restraint. That silence spoke volumes. But Alexander Whitmore wasn't finished. He leaned forward in his chair, his smirk growing wider as if feeding on the discomfort of others. He thrived on spectacle, and Naomi's silence wasn't enough to satisfy him. He lifted his hand, signaling for a waiter. His voice was laced with exaggerated politeness, each word calculated to humiliate. "Bring her the house wine," Whitmore said, his tone dripping with mock chivalry. "Not the reserve. I wouldn't want her to get confused." The waiter froze, his tray hovering uncertainly in the air. The tension around the table thickened. A senator coughed into his hand, trying to mask the unease. A woman at the far end lowered her eyes, unable to watch. The waiter hesitated. He had seen powerful men abuse their influence before, but something about this moment felt different, dangerous. Whitmore, sensing the hesitation, seized the opportunity to escalate. He stood, his movement exaggerated and theatrical, and snatched the wine bottle from the waiter's tray himself. "Allow me," he said, his voice booming across the table. And then, in one swift and deliberate motion, he tipped the bottle. The red liquid spilled out in a merciless stream, splattering across Naomi's silk gown. Gasps erupted around the room. The wine spread quickly, blooming like a cruel stain, crimson against midnight blue fabric, a deliberate wound painted in public view. It dripped onto the marble floor, darkening the pristine white stone like blood spilled in a sacred place. Naomi sat utterly still. She did not push back her chair. She did not recoil in horror. Her hands remained folded for a moment, as though she had been expecting the attack all along. Then, with slow, deliberate grace, she reached for her napkin. She dabbed at the spreading stain with the gentleness of someone brushing dust from a priceless painting. Her eyes never left Whitmore's face. Her lips did not part to curse him. Her expression did not falter with rage. Instead, she studied him with a gaze so steady it unsettled him more than any outburst could have. The silence stretched on. Around them, whispers began to ripple. "Did you see that?" He poured it on her deliberately. "Isn't anyone going to stop him?" But no one moved. No senator, no ambassador, no billionaire dared interfere. The room, full of people who prided themselves on courage in politics and business, had suddenly turned cowardly when confronted with cruelty in its rawest form. Whitmore chuckled, but his laugh was weaker now, less certain. Something in Naomi's silence unnerved him. He had expected her to break, to cry out, to rage, to storm away humiliated. Instead, she sat tall in her chair, shoulders squared, her calm composure making him look small, petty, and desperate. Naomi pressed the napkin gently against her dress one final time, then folded it neatly on the table, the crimson stain hidden within its folds. She lifted her chin, her gaze steady, her dignity intact. She had not spoken a word, yet the silence around her roared louder than thunder. That silence was louder than any outburst. While Whitmore laughed, while whispers of humiliation buzzed like bees around the table, Naomi Campbell Rivers was already 3 steps ahead. The insult, the stain, the laughter, none of it mattered, because Naomi did not come to this banquet unprepared. She had always known men like Alexander Whitmore, arrogant, careless, addicted to cruelty. They mistook humiliation for power, mistook silence for weakness. But Naomi had built an empire on silence, on patience, on waiting for the exact moment when her opponent believed they had won. As Whitmore toasted his own cleverness, Naomi's hand moved almost imperceptibly beneath the table. She reached for her phone, not to text a friend, not to call for security, but to press a single button, the kind most people in the room could never imagine existed. Her screen lit up softly, casting a glow on her silk gown, still stained crimson. She typed only 2 words. Activate Protocol 9. No one at the table noticed. No one, except perhaps Whitmore, who was too drunk on his own arrogance to understand what was happening. Around them, laughter continued, brittle and forced. The hostess in red leaned against the wall, her smirk faltering as though she had just realized she might have taken part in something bigger than she could control. And then, silently, the world began to shift. Far above the banquet, satellites connected. In glass towers across London, Dubai, and Hong Kong, servers blinked awake like a million watchful eyes. Secure networks unlocked. Folders stamped with Whitmore's empire insignia opened one by one. Digital vaults began to move. Contracts worth billions, painstakingly built through years of manipulation and intimidation, lit up with red cancellation stamps. Legal language unraveled line by line. Terms that once secured Whitmore's dominance now dissolved into digital smoke. In a boardroom in London, a banker's phone buzzed violently. What's happening? Why are all the Horizon agreements voided? In Dubai, investors stared in disbelief as entire projects vanished from their screens. In Hong Kong, a trading floor erupted into chaos as Whitmore's stocks plummeted faster than they could type orders. Within minutes, before dessert had even been served in Washington, $12 billion in deals collapsed like dominoes. Bankers scrambled. Investors panicked. Analysts shouted into headsets. Stock prices trembled. The empire Whitmore had built, brick by brick, arrogance by arrogance, began to crumble in real time. And Naomi? She sat still, silent, serene. Her gaze never left her plate. Her fork rested neatly beside her knife. She gave no outward sign of triumph, no smirk of satisfaction. Her silence remained her weapon, her calmness the knife Whitmore had never seen coming. The hostess in red returned. Her demeanor changed. The sharpness in her smile had dulled, replaced by nervousness. She bent slightly, pretending to refill Naomi's glass, but her eyes darted toward Whitmore, as if trying to make sense of the strange energy now filling the hall. Something had shifted, though she couldn't name it. Whitmore, still drunk on his earlier cruelty, raised his glass again in mockery. But then it happened. Buzz. A vibration from his phone. He ignored it. Buzz. Another. Then another. His smirk faltered. He pulled the phone from his pocket, glancing at the screen. His eyes widened. The laughter drained from his face like color from a canvas. Buzz. 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 The phone would not stop. Call after call. Message after message. Words like emergency, losses, canceled, flashed across his screen. He fumbled, his glass trembling in his other hand. The once impenetrable titan of finance looked suddenly small, his power slipping through his fingers faster than the wine he had spilled on Naomi's gown. Naomi finally turned her head, her expression calm, her voice low but steady, carrying across the table like a quiet verdict. "You should be careful, Mr. Whitmore." The room fell silent. Forks froze halfway to lips. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Every eye turned toward her. "Spilling wine," she continued, her tone deliberate, "is a small mess. Spilling empires leaves stains that never wash out." The words hung in the air like a blade. Whitmore's phone buzzed again, louder somehow, mocking him. His empire was unraveling before the very people he wanted to impress. Senators, ambassadors, billionaires. They were watching him fall apart in real time. The entire table froze. No one dared to laugh. No one dared to whisper. For the first time that evening, all eyes were on Naomi Campbell Rivers, the woman who had been humiliated, and yet, without raising her voice, had turned humiliation into annihilation. Her silence had been her strategy. Her patience had been her power. And now, her words were the nails sealing Whitmore's coffin. Whitmore's laughter had long since evaporated. Now his hands trembled under the table as he clutched his phone, his face lit by the cold glow of disaster. Each swipe of his thumb only confirmed the nightmare. Charts plunging downward, contracts voided, alerts screaming in red. His hedge fund down by billions in minutes. His contracts shredded with digital precision. His allies calling nonstop, their names flashing across the screen like vultures circling overhead. And the cruelest cut of all? Every single cancellation bore the same mark. Naomi Campbell Rivers. Her signature glared back at him from one document after another, a haunting reminder that while he had been spilling wine on silk, she had been dismantling his empire in silence. His skin turned pale, his smirk dissolved, and his jaw twitched as if words could no longer form properly. The great Alexander Whitmore, who once mocked CEOs and senators alike, looked less like a king of Wall Street and more like a drowning man grasping at air. Around the table, the whispers grew louder. Ambassadors leaned toward each other, their brows furrowed. "Is this true? She did this." Senators shifted uncomfortably, some tugging at their collars as if the very air had grown heavy. Investors who moments ago had laughed at Whitmore's cruelty now sat rigid, their eyes darting nervously between him and Naomi. The humiliation no longer belonged to her. It belonged to him. The man who believed he controlled the room was suddenly exposed as powerless. Whitmore pushed back his chair so violently it screeched across the marble, the sound cutting through the silence like a blade. His face flushed with panic and rage as he stood, his glass tumbling over, spilling the last of his wine across the pristine tablecloth. Is this a joke?" he stammered, his voice cracking in a way no one had ever heard before. You can't do this. Do you hear me? You can't do this." But the words sounded weak, pathetic, the cries of a man who realized too late that he had lost. Naomi, meanwhile, moved with the composure of someone who had already won long before the game even began. Slowly, she placed her napkin on the table, folding it neatly, deliberately. The crimson stain from Whitmore's earlier cruelty disappeared into its folds, tucked away like evidence preserved for history. The silence was unbearable now. Even the orchestra, sensing the shift in the room, faltered and let their music die mid-note. Only the clinking of trembling glasses and the heavy thud of Whitmore's panicked breaths filled the hall. Naomi rose with quiet grace, each movement slow, deliberate, powerful. Her gown shimmered under the chandeliers despite the stain that marred it, and in that moment, it seemed less like a mark of humiliation and more like a badge of victory. Every step she took echoed against the marble, measured like a judge delivering a sentence. The eyes of the room followed her, wide with awe, fear, and disbelief. At the edge of the table, she paused. She turned her head only once, her gaze locking on Whitmore. Her voice, low and steady, carried with the weight of truth. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, her words slicing through the silence like glass shattering. "I don't do jokes. I do business." The chandeliers above flickered as if the room itself acknowledged her power. Glasses on the table trembled, reflecting the tremors running through Whitmore's once untouchable empire. For the first time that night, everyone in that hall senators, billionaires, ambassadors, the hostess in red, recognized who truly owned the banquet. It wasn't the man with the wine bottle. It wasn't the Wall Street legend. It was the woman he had tried to humiliate. Naomi Campbell Rivers. The silence that followed was not emptiness. It was respect. It was fear. It was the sound of a room reordering its loyalties in real time. Every guest knew they would leave that banquet with a story to tell. A story about the night power shifted hands without a single scream, without a single outburst, only a folded napkin and a whispered sentence. Whitmore, his phone buzzing endlessly in his palm, stood frozen. His empire collapsed around him, and yet he could not move, could not speak, could not reclaim even a shred of dignity. He was a statue carved in failure. Naomi turned and walked away, her steps calm, unhurried, her presence leaving an indelible mark on the hall. She did not need to look back. She knew the ruins of vanity and arrogance lay behind her. She knew the whispers had already transformed into legends. And as the great doors of the banquet hall opened before her, the air outside seemed lighter, freer, as though the night itself was waiting to embrace the victor. Inside, the chandeliers still glittered, the glasses still shone, the guests still sat in stunned silence. But the banquet would never be remembered for the speeches, the wine, or the chandeliers. It would be remembered as the night Alexander Whitmore fell, and Naomi Campbell Rivers walked away owning the room. As Naomi Campbell Rivers moved toward the grand exit of the Washington Grand Hotel, whispers followed her like shadows, curling through the hall and weaving into every corner of the room. Senators, normally composed and calculating, leaned in to murmur her name under their breath, as if speaking it aloud might summon the sheer force of her presence. Journalists furiously scribbled notes, trying to capture a moment that defied ordinary description. Investors exchanged frantic calls, their voices sharp and panicked, struggling to understand how billions had evaporated before their eyes. Even the hostess in red, who had started the night confident and poised, now could not meet her own reflection in the polished silverware, her bold color muted against the weight of Naomi's triumph. Whitmore stood frozen near the head table, a statue carved from arrogance and disbelief. His empire collapsed in real time before him, stock prices plummeting, contracts voided, alliances crumbling. Every alert, every notification, every buzzing phone reminded him that his plans had been undone by the very person he had sought to humiliate. He had entered the banquet believing he controlled the narrative, confident in his ability to assert dominance over anyone in the room. And yet here he was powerless, exposed as a fool in front of the world's most influential people. Naomi's footsteps echoed across the marble floor, steady and measured, each step resonating like a heartbeat of authority. She did not rush. She did not falter. She carried with her the weight of strategy and patience, of calculated silence that had spoken louder than any outburst could have. With every movement, she reminded the onlookers that true power does not need to scream. It simply manifests, unassailable and undeniable. Outside, the night air greeted her like an old ally. It was cool, calm, and welcoming, brushing softly against her face as if acknowledging the victory she had just claimed. The banquet behind her would continue, clinking glasses, uneasy laughter, whispered conversations, but it would never again hold the same meaning. The chandeliers might continue to glitter. The menu might be praised. The speeches might be remembered in passing. Yet no detail of that night would overshadow the indelible truth. A black CEO, mocked and humiliated in public, had dismantled billions in deals with nothing but her strategy, her intellect, and the quiet force of her presence. She reached her car, a sleek vehicle waiting silently at the curb, its dark windows reflecting the calm night. Without hesitation, she stepped inside and closed the door behind her. She did not look back. There was no need. The impression she left behind, the echoes of her power, the ruin of Whitmore's arrogance, the stunned silence of an entire hall, was already permanent. It would follow the guests, the press, and the investors for weeks, months, perhaps even years. Even Whitmore, the man who had believed himself untouchable, could not erase the memory of her control. The red wine spilled on silk had seemed a minor humiliation at first, a petty act of cruelty. But the world had watched as that moment of mockery transformed into a lesson in dominance, patience, and intelligence. Whitmore's empire, built on intimidation and force, had fallen not because of anger or shouting, but because Naomi had understood that true power is exercised quietly, strategically, and without need for validation. The hall remained frozen in the aftershock of her departure. Conversation stalled, glasses trembled, and a tense, heavy silence lingered in the air. Even the staff, trained to remain unnoticed, could not escape the gravity of what had occurred. Every eye that had once watched Naomi with skepticism now held a spark of awe, a recognition of the rare force she represented. It was more than victory, it was legacy in motion. And yet, Naomi did not celebrate. She did not raise her voice. She did not indulge in gloating or confrontation. She simply walked away, leaving behind the ruins of vanity and arrogance. Broken contracts, shattered confidence, and a hall full of witnesses who would never forget her presence were the only testaments needed to her power. Her exit was the final punctuation to the story of the night, the story of a woman who understood that influence, control, and authority are measured not by how loudly you speak, but by how effectively you act. The grandeur of the chandeliers, the sparkle of crystal glasses, the murmured exclamations of powerful men and women, all were secondary to the enduring lesson she had imparted. Dignity, intelligence, and patience triumph over cruelty and hubris every time. Naomi Campbell Rivers did not need applause. She did not require recognition. The world had already acknowledged her supremacy. She had claimed her victory silently, gracefully, and irrevocably. And as the night carried on without her, one truth remained crystal clear, that, more than any empire, more than any fortune, more than any title, was the true meaning of power.